NASA Voyager mission celebrated its 40th anniversary in August. And that's a sort of, I think, interesting place to start. It's a place to look back at the extraordinary achievements that were done with what looks today like very primitive technology, but was also an amazingly exciting thing. I remember at the time that when new results would come back from it, when it would reach a new planet. So, Jim, perhaps I could start with you. What are the lessons for us today from Voyager, and what does it tell us about the future of robotic exploration?
Oh my gosh, where to start? First of all, thanks for the invitation to participate in this. It's going to be a lot of fun today. I got my start as a student on Voyager back in the 80s at the Uranus encounter. And one of the things that it's easy to say, and maybe you even did say it, or it was written somewhere, it was primitive technology, But one of the things...
I just said that, sorry about it.
Yeah. Okay. One of the things that I think is really important to recognize is that when that spacecraft was assembled in the mid-1970s, it was the cutting edge. It was a combination of two things. It was a combination of the cutting edge technology available at the time and the pragmatic technology that a very conservative space agency would allow you to put onto a spacecraft at that time. So even today, we can't fly 20 megapixel cameras on Mars rovers because they've never flown in space, and it's very, very conservative. So one of the lessons is that you always have to push the limits and find the edge of the technology that you can fly, at least if you're working with a very conservative governmental space agency. And part of that, part of those technological innovations were things that maybe weren't appreciated at the time, but turned out to be absolutely crucial to the mission, like the ability to reprogram the spacecraft. Voyager was the first one that could be reprogrammed. We take it for granted nowadays. We reprogram our cars, right? You don't even think about it. But the ability to change the code on board, the ability to make the spacecraft behave differently when it's much farther from the sun than when it was closer to the sun, that was absolutely critical.
There are some amazing things that were done to the Voyager craft in that way through software updates. There were hacks to get around memory, cells that had been destroyed by cosmic rays. There were, parts of the craft failed mechanically, and so I think with the Neptune encounter, there was this very clever way of tilting it so that the camera could pan. And
exactly.
There was some amazing, and then there was even new compression algorithms that were uploaded to it that didn't exist when it was launched.
Absolutely.
That allowed it to send more back. What's your favorite? I've written about this a few times because I just love the idea of the kind of, I think it's called it the long arm of the celestial repairman, or the celestial mechanic, if you like.
Yes.
What's your favorite example of these hacks? Because there are several of them on the Mars rovers as well, aren't there?
Yeah. Well, I think Voyager has probably one of my favorites, and that is, out at Neptune, you're talking about sunlight that's 1% as bright as sunlight here on the Earth, and camera system that was designed primarily for a mission at Jupiter and Saturn, much closer to the sun. So you need much longer exposures out in the deep outer solar system. But you take a long exposure, then your image gets blurred because you're flying by at 10 miles per second. And so what they did was they made the camera work with the thrusters and the attitude control system of the spacecraft to do these beautiful pirouettes. So while the shutter was open, they'd kind of keep this kind of ballet-like dance to allow those beautiful images that we've seen from the outer solar system. And I don't think they had anticipated having to do that. But again, that flexibility was built in for the first time, which was a huge, huge advance. And of course, now every mission since has had that kind of flexibility.
So where do we see the legacy of that in modern? We do things like drive rovers backwards on Mars because they're one of the, I think it was more reliable that way. But where do we see today the manifestation of this this ingenuity to reprogram things that began with Voyager?
I think it's all over the place. I mentioned it's in cars nowadays too, right? But in the space program, it's the idea of needing that flexibility, the whole idea of failure modes. They call it fault tree analysis, the contingencies, what if. It comes down to the fact that these things are hundreds of millions of miles away, billions of miles away. You can't do a service call on them, but you have to be able to change in response to changing circumstances. And that's just a fundamental aspect of not just planetary probes, but Earth orbital spacecraft, and of course, lots of systems now here.
I think it's gone too far. So I'm a gamer, and when you get a new games console, you plug it in, and you basically have to spend about 8 hours before you can play the first game, because it needs to download a system update, which is usually 2 or 3 gig, and then you put the first game in, and then the game has an update. So it's basically ship now, patch later, and I think that's acceptable when you have a small spacecraft on the other side of the solar system. But I wish more software engineers would, build things that work the first time out of the box.
Yeah, well.
I think we've lost a sort of discipline to, and this is probably a good place to bring in Tom from HPE. What do you think about this? Have we become lazy as software engineers, and we're just like, oh, whatever, we'll send a patch next week?
Did you want me to comment on, did we become lazy, or?
Well, let's start with that. Let's start with being lazy. Let's start with that. Have we gone too far?
First, let me say very, very quickly, Hewlett-Packard Enterprise is thrilled to sponsor this event, and I'm very happy to be here with my colleagues as well. But I'm glad you asked me to comment on that, because in general, this notion of repairability and this notion of reconfigurability, as Jim mentioned, usually you have a trade-off and the function is fixed. And the initiative that we're going to announce today, which we call the Extreme Edge Initiative, or Project Extreme Edge, is building technologies that are faster than fixed technologies, but they also are reconfigurable on the fly. Now, that reconfigurability has 2 dimensions. The one you brought up, which is we call RAS, or reliability, availability, and serviceability, to reconfigure around issues. But secondly, also to reconfigure the actual mission workload algorithm that's being run in the event something goes wrong, or in the event there's a unforeseen circumstance to accommodate.
So I think there's that all sounds, in general terms, like admirable things to do with computers, but you have a specific example of this, don't you? Because you have a supercomputer on the space station at the moment.
We do. So
what's different about that compared with, because there's a bit of a joke that, the space shuttle had 386s in it and all this sort of stuff. I mean, it was, so what's different about that machine?
Well, it's a bit of an antinomy in a sense that we have the HPE Apollo system, that happens to be its brand name, right on the spacecraft, but it has 2 interesting dimensions that at first don't sound necessarily like they'd come together. But the first one is it's ordinary, open standard technology. And therefore
commercial off the shelf.
Yeah, and therefore it's the latest, it's the fastest. But secondly, we had to wrap it around with intellectual property and invention, and that's part of our value add here. And that invention around this open standard technology that does the compute engine is around the software hardening.
Right, so it's software hardened rather than hardware hardened. Now, I can imagine how hardware hardening works, where you, I don't know, put some physical barrier between the processor, and then you test it for 10 years, and this is why you end up with 10-year-old processors
or redundancy
into space. So how do you do it in software? I mean, can you really make up for cosmic rays zapping bits of your RAM?
We can by predictive analysis and by looking at things like memory leaks and resources being either failing or resources being used in an exhaustive way, and then being able to reprogram around them, and to be able to also have redundancy built into the software. So we have, very, very frankly, on a NASA spacecraft right now, we have the...
And how's it working? Because I think it was launched a couple of months ago. Is it performing as well as you
Well, right, there is not a failure, because failure is not an option. And also we have the...
It just goes slower or something, doesn't it? When it's worried, then it clocks down or something?
Yes, if you allow me to say, one other innovation is the way it interfaces with the power system. Mm-hmm. And there is an enclosure that we have built to cool it. We have to cool it, and there's not a lot of room on the spacecraft, obviously. So we had a lot of challenges, and we're pleased to work with NASA to bring this technology forward. But that's really just a precursor, Tom, into what we're doing with the Extreme Edge. We're literally building new technology and new chips that are not digital, and they're rather analog, meaning they're going to be faster. We don't have the switching time and the ones and zeros conversions needed to actually do these compute algorithms. And we're announcing, as part of the Extreme Edge, the dot product engine. Now, a dot product is a mathematical application, many of you know, and it is used in many, many high-performance calculations and high-performance computing calculations, scientific and engineering. But it does it the fastest we know, and when we do commercialize it, it should be the fastest. And we're combining that with our HPE EdgeLine systems that we've already built for the Edge here on Earth.
So this is a kind of analog coprocessor or something, is it?
It is. It's an accelerator, per se. The story gets better. It actually couples with a photonic communication system that helps the immunity.
It's fully buzzword compliant from the sound of it.
It is, yes.
Presumably there are algorithms that this is well suited for, and others.
Absolutely.
I mean, so what, machine learning and things like that, where, I mean, is there a trade-off between speed and precision with this?
Yes, so we've manifested the buzzwords in reality right on the booth over there, so one can see the photonic.
Right, so you can go and see that it's all real and not just buzzwords and hype.
It is. It's absolutely there.
Go and check it out.
And therefore the notion that we were doing this to establish the extreme edges on Earth, which would be a smart city perhaps, or an autonomous vehicle, an oil rig. And now we're taking it up a notch effectively and calling it the extreme edge, or sometimes the infinite edge, because what is farther out than space. And we believe that we have to be very independent. So the computing capability has to be there on the edge. The connectivity has to be there on the edge.
So the edge being the opposite of being in the middle in the cloud. So the idea then is that if you've got a Mars rover or a self-driving car, it can't be going back to the cloud to say, I've got a problem, what do I do? It needs to have enough processing power locally to deal with whatever the problem is.
Yeah, how fast do you want to know in an autonomous car that there is a person ahead of you versus perhaps a plastic bag? And to know that image recognition, well, now when you're out in space and you're talking about minutes, 20 minutes, 10 minutes from communication back to the Earth, we have to figure out ways to get compute in 3 dimensions: faster, lighter, and smaller, and then of course lower power, because there's not a lot of energy on a spacecraft. Or even when we jump to colonizing the planets and the extraterrestrial bodies, there's not going to be initially a lot of power there or a lot of space necessarily.
Let me just bring, before we go to Robin, let me just bring Jim in very quickly on that. So with the rovers, for example, that are being designed now, I mean, there are already rovers that plan their own routes. They have a certain amount of autonomy. They decide which rocks not to crash into and so on. So will the availability of more recent hardware, if all of this works, in those rovers allow them to do much more exciting things?
Absolutely. I mean, right now we deal in a world of long latency. It's the many minutes time lag back and forth to Mars. At the fastest, it's a little under 10 minutes. At the slowest, it's maybe 20, 30, 40 minutes. And so we can't joystick these things. So they need onboard smarts. And even then, we still are in contact with them once a day, and so if they find some plastic bag on Mars, who knows, abandoned shopping cart, whatever, stop, take a picture of it, and phone home. And we basically will spend a 24-hour Earth day cycle figuring out what's going on. Give them more smarts, whether they're on orbit or on the surface or whatever, the ability to use pattern recognition, the ability to make decisions within the realm of safety and mission safety and all that. I think it's absolutely going to be advantageous. It's a real hard limit right now that we're up against.
If I could add real quick, 2 dimensions of that annihilation of latency from edge to Earth in this conversation. The first is we can do more things because we're doing them faster. So in the hour, the day, there's more to do. And secondly, we can respond quicker in a mission critical situation.
Cool. Well, we've talked. So it sounds like the prospects are quite good for the offspring of Voyager and the current crop of robotic probes. That we're going to have smarter hardware that can do more stuff and is not quite so out of date when we launch it. But where does the human factor fit into this, Robin? Is our ability to support people in space progressing as quickly as the robotic technology seems to be?
Yes, I believe it is, and we're starting now with the International Space Station, which last week, by the way, celebrated 17 years of being continuously occupied by astronauts from the US and our international partners. So if you think about it, today's senior class for high school has never known a time when there haven't been humans living and working in space. So that's really incredible. Today on the space station, of course, we've been supporting that crew with regenerative life support systems and other systems to keep the crew healthy on board the space station, but we rely a lot on the supply chain from Earth. Fortunately, we have our commercial cargo vehicles resupplying. We've got a launch coming up on Saturday for another mission to deliver cargo. So what we're trying to do, though, is we need to, in order to develop a sustained and continuous human presence out into the solar system, we need to break that supply chain. So we're using the space station today as a test bed to do that. And we're evolving the systems that we have supporting the crew today into the systems that we're going to need to venture into deep space using the space station.
So what are the particular areas of focus? I remember the live streaming of an astronaut eating some lettuce,
yes.
which was kind of strangely powerful, because this was a thing that had been grown off Earth and was being consumed off Earth. And if we're going to make this work, presumably we're going to have to do a whole load more of that. But beyond lettuce, where are the focuses that NASA is looking at?
Well, in the area of life support systems, today on the space station, we recycle about half of our oxygen from carbon dioxide. We've kind of closed our air loop halfway. We recycle 90% of our water. And so what we're trying to do is evolve that into a more closed loop life support system, in which will take some new technologies, as well as, we're not developing a whole new life support system. We're evolving from what we have today, because one of the lessons that we learned is it takes a while to develop that technology and prove it. So our goal is to evolve what we have today on the space station into that system, and also run it for many years so that we can prove the reliability. Because even more than closing that loop, we need a reliable system, because once we close the hatch on the spacecraft going to Mars, that's what the crew has. The other technologies, the ability to do in-space manufacturing, so that if we do have failures, we can potentially reproduce parts that we need, and in-situ resource utilization, so we get to our destination, we can sort of live off the land. The plant biology, because the crew is going to need fresh, nutritious food along the journey. All of those technologies, and then the human research that we're doing on the space station today as well. You're familiar with our one-year crew and our twin study. All of that is looking at the risks for long-duration space flight on the human, and ways to mitigate those risks when we go beyond low Earth orbit.
I understand you have something called the ISS National Lab, which is about trying to develop commercial markets.
Yes.
Jeff Bezos is very keen on this sci-fi vision of like manufacturing in space. What's the advantage of, what can you do in that environment that you can't do on Earth? What are the benefits of that?
Well, that's exactly what the other aspect of the space station. Not only are we using as a test bed to enable future missions beyond low Earth orbit, but we're trying to open up low Earth orbit through the space station as a platform, and the National Lab, to broad sectors of commercial markets, to explore what can be done in microgravity, and how can it help businesses open markets not only in space, but enhance their business on Earth. And we have a nonprofit, the Center for Advancement of Science in Space, or CASIS, that manages those national lab resources that we've set aside, which is 50% of the cargo, the volume, the space on the spacecraft, and the crew time to be able to operate those.
And what sorts of things are there? I mean, I remember last time I looked into this, it was things like you can grow crystals in microgravity that you couldn't grow on Earth. But what in practice is actually constrained by gravity that then means you can do new things when you haven't got gravity?
Yeah, all kinds of things. Exotic fiber manufacturing is something that we'll be investigating very soon. You mentioned protein crystal growth, pharmaceutical research. There's a lot of biological research going on in rodents and other model organisms.
And that's looking at the, is that specifically looking at the impact of microgravity on them, so that as a human analog?
Exactly.
Right. Okay, so ultimately that does feed into how we keep humans in space for a longer period. But I think part of the sci-fi vision of manufacturing in space is that you bring the resources in, and this is something we're going to be touching on later on, that you have factories in space when you can get the asteroids or comets or whatever into low Earth orbit, and the convenience comes from access to a very wide range of resources. But there is a question here of, why wouldn't those factories be robotic? So I just wanted to dig into this question of the relative merits of human versus robotic missions beyond low Earth orbit. Jim, what's your thought on this? Do you have a sort of preference? Are they complementary? Does it make sense to send humans to explore Mars? Should we just build more robots?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of a false debate, actually. When you look at missions like Voyager or Mars rovers, and those are human exploration missions being done by human beings through the avatar of technology. We see Mars through the eyes of the rovers. We see, the rings of Saturn through the eyes of the Cassini spacecraft. May it rest in peace. And it takes hundreds, thousands of people here on Earth to do that. It's not like you push a button, robot, go explore, go write the science papers or whatever. So we're already embedded in it. We're already there doing it. We're just not physically there.
That's another way of saying we don't need to be physically there.
Well, so I firmly believe that there are a whole range of things that robots can do, that they do really well, that they should do, and especially things like initial reconnaissance. You know, what's the mass of that asteroid? What are the molecules in that atmosphere, et cetera, et cetera. You don't need people to do that. We can build machines that do those kinds of things. But that, to me, is the vanguard. It's this, you know, the scouts that you send out to do your reconnaissance. When you start getting beyond how many rocks are on that hill, or what's the size of that water reservoir on a certain object, when you get beyond just counting facts and things that you can program into the realm of, and as a scientist, why is that there? What's the process that made that form that way? What does this mean for the evolution of our own planet? You know, you can't program, even in great supercomputers, you can't program those kinds of things, right? This comes from a geologist's gut instinct, the experience of an astronomer, you know, physics background, chemistry. These are things that, questions that we can ask that people are going to have to answer. So there is kind of a science threshold beyond which that you really get at process, origin, evolution, implications that requires, at least for now, the human brain,
right,
and to sort of logic out. And so I think
now
for those things, I think we have to send people to do that, right? And that's the science argument. There's a whole other argument we can get into that's, you know, because we are human beings and we explore and we push the frontier, and okay, that's another reason, of course, to send people, inspirational, nationalistic. You know, there's many, many different angles to take this at. But on the science side, I really do think that the robotics and human exploration are intimately tied together. When people go to Mars, there will be robots there waiting for them. They'll be bringing robots with them to help do things. They'll be up in orbit helping them out that way as well. And I think that's true across the solar system.
Robin, what's the current sort of NASA thinking on this balance between human and robotic exploration?
Well, Jim said it very well. I think it takes both. I think the robotic precursor missions set us up for the knowledge that we, you know, filling those knowledge gaps that we need to then plan the human mission to those destinations. And we're working in close coordination. I'm in the Human Exploration Mission Directorate. Our colleagues in the Science Mission Directorate and us are working in close collaboration because we don't have an infinite amount of resources to develop joint missions, you know, together that where we can couple our human exploration goals with our science goals. One example is the Deep Space Gateway, which is the outpost that we're planning to build in the area around the moon. This is going to be our proving ground, our next stepping stone for venturing out beyond low Earth orbit with humans, but we're also leveraging our science community to see what science objectives can we also achieve at this destination.
And presumably more autonomy. Does that move the barrier between what you need a robot to do and what you need a human to do? Because if we can make smarter robots, and we can make them maybe not as smart as a human geologist, but pretty smart, then the point at which you have to start sending the human geologists kind of recedes. Isn't that? So it's sort of a moving target here, isn't it?
You know, if I may add, I believe that the advancements in technology, robotics, and other types of combined cyber and physical, you know, systems will give us more choice. In other words, we don't necessarily have to send the robotic non-human anymore because the technology is making it safer for human. Contrary-wise, we don't necessarily have to send the human because it's too hostile or too, you know, much of a risk, and therefore we're going to have more selectivity choice. We'll lower risks, and we can add the enjoyment factor, I think, that you brought up, Jim.
Sure,
sure. Now we have a choice to go as opposed to I could never go.
Sure, and risk is a big, I mean, it's going to be a long time before humans explore the surface of Venus, right? I mean, it's a crazy, risky, incredible environment, but we have a lot of questions about why is that planet so different than the Earth? It's basically a twin of the Earth. What's going on? What are the implications? And so we need to get down there and answer those questions. You have to send robotics today.
With Mars in particular, there's a quite nice compromise between these two positions, which is you have humans in orbit controlling robots with much lower latency. Is that a sort of likely stepping stone, or
yeah,
just go straight to humans on the surface?
Absolutely. I think, you know, and the Planetary Society did a study last year, and we looked at this very carefully with JPL, and Lockheed has done their own study as well. And not only do you potentially provide the ability to do sort of very low latency science from that orbital platform, but you also kind of untangle the need to develop the lander at exactly the same time you develop the orbiter, right? So you can spread the program out.
So it gives you that incremental approach that we have with Apollo.
Apollo 8 before Apollo 11, right? And that similar kind of thinking. And so we embrace that, and I know NASA's thinking a lot about that same kind of architecture too.
I think our first mission to Mars might very well be an orbital mission where we do some telerobotics first.
Mm. Yeah. Do I take from your previous answer, though, that there is much more of a focus on the moon at the moment as the logical next place?
Well, we've been planning in our stepwise approach, starting with the space station, and our next step would be this outpost we're calling the Deep Space Gateway that we're putting in the area around the moon. And that we're using as our kind of proving ground. Our international partners have also been interested in doing activities on the lunar surface. And this outpost will allow those countries to do activities on the lunar surface while we prepare to go beyond to other destinations. The National Space Council, which had its first meeting, headed up by the Vice President, made some statements about wanting to go back to the lunar surface and issued an action to NASA to develop a study and a report back. We're in the process of looking at that and seeing what those options are. So stay tuned. We may be.
It must be difficult, though, to plan these things which require, multi-decade horizons when you have essentially changing political, different people coming and going in the White House, but you also have different priorities for whether we should do a heroic mission to Mars. No, we should be going back to the moon. How do you actually deal with that? Because it seems to me like there have been quite a lot of changes in focus in the last 10 or 20 years. How can you cope with that?
Yeah, it is challenging when you have a different administration come in, maybe have a different idea. But the way we've been approaching it is to develop these capabilities. They're sort of almost destination agnostic.
So it's to focus on capabilities, not missions.
And then we can adapt those to the mission. For example, in my area in life support systems, we know we need to develop more regenerative, reliable systems, regardless of whether we go to the moon, the Mars, or Venus, or wherever. We're going to need those capabilities. And we're going to need the heavy lift rocket. We're going to need the Orion spacecraft. So all of those building blocks, are not being cast aside. Right.
And
exactly.
But to what extent? But that gets you so far because you've got obviously you're going to need life support, but certain kinds of mission are going to demand certain kinds of spacecraft,
exactly.
and you're not going to be able to use Orion for everything. So how do you cope? So there's sort of a base level of capabilities, but then how do you stack the missions on top of that in practice?
That's what we're beginning to do. So we've developed a space level of capabilities. Our next step is these deep space habitation capability that we're going to need. And then you're right, once you get a definite destination and mission, we will need to develop additional capabilities, such as landers, other surface systems. So at that point, the road may diverge.
Yeah.
Now, one of the ways you could be less dependent on political changes would be, I assume, collaboration with the private sector, which will have its own agenda and its own funding and so on. So how would you characterize the state of that cooperation at the moment?
Oh, it's huge. So NASA's been, we believe, in order to achieve our all collective goals, it's going to take the best of NASA, our international partners, and our commercial partners to do that. What we've been doing is identifying areas of intersection between what commercial companies are interested in doing in space with what NASA's needs are. And that way we can leverage a public-private partnership in sort of a shared risk, shared gain model. And we're doing that more and more. And so I believe that our next steps are already, involving this type of partnership.
And with the capabilities like life support, is that the sort of thing that's available to the private sector? I mean, how do they, in practice, learn about about the advances that you've made? Do they read the peer-reviewed journals, or is there a formal technology transfer to people like SpaceX who want to send humans to Mars and so on? How do they, in practice, learn from what you've done on the space station?
Yeah, today on Space Station it is primarily a NASA-driven activity with some commercial partners. There's new players coming on board all the time. We're leveraging some technology that they've developed. We just flew a DNA sequencer on Space Station for the first time, completely off the shelf, to sequence DNA on the space station for the first time last year. So we are leveraging those technologies and trying to enable our commercial partners by transferring that technology so they can use it in their endeavors in low Earth orbit and beyond as well.
Yeah, they form these Space Act agreements with companies or foundations or even individuals in some cases to get that information out. And I think it's kind of a two-way street too, right? I mean, companies are out there, universities are out there doing research, and that feeds back in as well. So I totally agree that this is really an exciting time for commercial space activities. It may not be a NASA astronaut that's next on the moon.
Right.
It could be a private company astronaut. It could be a different country's astronaut. You know, the first footsteps on Mars might not be NASA. And that's really exciting because it was really hard to envision that even about a decade ago. But
well, that brings us neatly to, we have an app, which I hope you've all installed, which has a polling feature in it. And I'd like to try it out, because we'll be using it throughout the day. Basically, if you log into the app, and I think you basically have to go to the entry in the app for the current session and then scroll down to the bottom, and I think you can then see two things. One is the ability to send us questions. So if you want to send questions to the panelists, you're welcome to do that. And the other thing I think you can do is respond to the poll. So can we have the first poll question, please? Because it's about exactly this question of how quickly technology is advancing. No, hang on a minute. That's the answer. And we've had exactly one vote, as you can see. Right, can we have the question and not the answer, please? Well, I'll tell you what the question is. It's essentially this. How do you think, here we are, how will space technology improve in the next 10 years compared with the past 10? So do you think it's accelerating and it will get better more quickly in the next decade? Do you think it'll be about the same rate? Or do you think we've actually picked a lot of low-hanging fruit in the last decade and things might even slow down in the next 10 years? So I'll leave you all to vote on that now while we continue the discussion up here, but we can come back to the answer there. And also, if you have any questions you'd like to ask the panelists, I'll be opening things up for Q&A shortly. But just before we do, we've talked about the public-private relationship. We've talked about exploration. We've talked about the balance between human and robotic roles in all of that. The final thing I wanted to ask you all about, and it's something we're going to be coming back to a lot today, because the subtitle of this event is The Business Case to Dream, is let's look beyond exploration and let's just look at this through in a much more cold-eyed way as just commercialization. Where do you all think the opportunities are for that? And perhaps I could ask each of you in turn where you think the kind of near and medium-term opportunities are. Why don't we start with you, Tom? What do you think?
I think first I would say that when we look at it, we obviously have a technology lens. From a compute perspective and from a controls perspective. But we do believe that there's opportunity to drive these products that would benefit, of course, the mission, that would benefit the opportunity as well as our own company, if they are more integrated and lighter weight and faster, and that's why we're investing there. And we believe that that will be a means, of course, to a bigger end. And those bigger ends, as you're asking, will be related in scientific discovery, which I believe can lead to many things, such as, for example, new materials, or such as medical breakthroughs, or such as the response and the dosage response or the time frequency response of treatments that are taking place for human health. But again, it all has to be based on a tremendous amount of compute power that can get there, that can actually get there. And that's why we're focused on that dimension.
And you, as a vendor, obviously the immediate
that's right.
opportunity for you is selling stuff to people. I mean, you're going to need lots of computing power and space to make any of this stuff work. So that's an immediate one for you. What do you think about the sort of near term and then slightly further off?
Well, Tom, I'm really eager to find out. I know certainly the Earth's economic sphere is now extended into low Earth orbit, right? I mean, there's business to be done there. It's dominated by the communication satellite industry, billions of dollars, global industry, and lots of opportunities some scientific opportunities as well. And we know that, okay, there is a business case for low Earth orbit. Is there a business case for deep space? I don't know. I mean, there's some entrepreneurs.
Before we go out of low Earth orbit, and just during the day, generally, what we'll be doing is sort of starting on Earth and gradually moving away from that. But before we move on to that, what do you think the low Earth orbit business? I mean, you've mentioned telecoms, but there are others there, surely, that are.
Well, I mean, telecom is dominating,
right.
And it probably will continue to dominate. But then, as the satellite population builds up, increasingly, there'll be a need for maintenance on orbit. There'll be need for replacement of those technologies, just continuing updating that technology, and it's easy to get to low Earth orbit. So I think it's very clear, and there's a lot of people in this room know better than I do, that there's a solid business case to be made for low Earth orbit. Going beyond is the question, and I know people, there's people in this room who are betting on that, right, in many different ways. My personal opinion is I think that tourism is going to be huge. I actually have a book coming out in the spring about this. I think right now we know where the hot tourist destinations are across the solar system that people are going to want to go to.
So what's your bucket list then? Where would you go first?
Oh my God, I don't even know where to begin. I mean, I want to spend a weekend on the moon. I've told my kids that before I'm done. And there's all kinds of great places to explore. But there's a cliff on one of the moons of Uranus where you can cliff dive down this 10-mile slope, right? I want to fly through the largest canyon in the solar system on Mars. All of these things are going to happen, and the tourism industry will extend out to deep space, right? You can do Antarctic adventure tourism now. It's high-end, it's pricey, and the same thing will be true in space. But
let the record show that was the first Antarctic analogy of the day. I'm sure there will be many more.
Yes. But so I'm really excited about the tourist opportunities that are going to be out there.
I remember seeing the transit of Venus in 2004, I think it was the last one, and there isn't another one in my lifetime, unless I go to Mars. There's one around my 90th birthday, and you get transits of Venus more often from Mars.
Or you get in a spaceship that takes you to the right place.
Yeah, well, quite.
You can see a transit for hours and hours, days in a row. Right?
Excellent. Okay, so tourism is the so telecoms in low Earth orbit, and then tourism is the place to look next. Do you think, Robin? What's your take on this? Where do you think the biggest opportunities are?
Well, like Jim, I'm anxious to find out. We're doing all we can today with the space station to try to enable this development of this demand. NASA's vision is to transition low Earth orbit from primarily NASA-funded NASA activity to commercial activity, where we will become one of many customers of a thriving economy. And then we can go on to do great things in deep space. I believe it's going to be a mixture of things. What we're really hoping is that we'll be able to sustain permanent human platforms in low Earth orbit. Today, we're not seeing that market demand. We see a lot of, on the supply side, people wanting to supply platforms and rockets and services. But that demand side is what we're trying to open up.
Well, that's what we're trying to dig into today. So that's why we're here. Okay, let's see the results of the poll, if we may. You're all very optimistic, though. This is just the beginning of the S-curve or whatever. So that's a pretty clear answer, and at least 10 of you have figured out how to use the app, which is good to see. It's certainly a multiple of 10, isn't it? So, anyway, we've got a few more minutes left, so I'd like to open things up for questions from the floor for our panelists. So if anyone got any questions, and if you could tell us before you ask your question who you are and what your affiliation is, that would be very helpful. So do we have any questions from the floor? And would I be able to see if you did? Yes, there's a gentleman over here, and there's someone over here. Can we go to the back here first?
Robin, one of the fundamental technologies for all of deep space.
Behold, a microphone.
Oh, right. Yeah. One of the fundamental technologies for all of the human deep space missions is radiation protection. What is NASA doing, and what potentially could the private side be doing in terms of enhancing tech for radiation so that people on deep space missions don't get increased chance of cancer, et cetera?
Right. This is a big area of research for us. Today on the space station, we're limited exposure. Once we get out beyond the Van Allen belts, it's a much greater exposure, and so that's a big area of risk reduction activity going on at NASA today. We've got very shielding kinds of technologies that we're developing and trying to test. There's pharmaceutical research going on, what kind of medications can, and then just trying to limit the trip, because while we can shield from solar particles, the galactic cosmic radiation is a big problem. And so when we go and what that environment is and trying to limit the exposure are all strategies in addition to improving our shielding and those kinds of capabilities.
Cool, thank you very much for that question. We had another question quite nearby over here. Is the microphone still in that part of the world? It is.
Jeff Grayson, I've got so many affiliations, it's hard to keep straight with them. I'm a serial entrepreneur in the space industry, I suppose. Yeah. There's a lens through which many of the speakers seem to view space issues, and I'd like to challenge that a little bit. I think I can best do that by analogy. You know, we talked about how we might do with this or that with robots or that with people, and it's like, oh, here we are in Seattle. You know, thanks to the Discovery missions of the ship Discovery and George Vancouver, you know, we have discovered Puget Sound. And now think of all the wonderful things we can do with it. We can study how the trees grow. We can send scientists to figure out how the glaciers formed the various bays of the valley. I mean, that's just great. It's just going to be the greatest thing for science ever. And of course, that's why we're all here, right? Seattle has no other possible uses than what it can teach us for science. And it's frustrating to me as somebody who thinks about space as a environment in which we can expand the reach of the human species, in which we can all make money, in which we can all become richer, better, you know, more powerful people. That the only thing we ever seem to hear about from our government agencies is what it can teach us scientifically. And I'd like to hear a little bit about that.
Anyone want to come back on that? Jim?
Well, I mean, I'm a scientist. Of course I care about science. But I think I touched on that a little bit. Certainly, I want to also just go explore as a tourist as well. I think those opportunities are going to be out there. Let's pretend that this does actually happen a couple hundred years from now. It's easy to go. It's as easy to go anywhere in the solar system as it is to go anywhere on the planet today. You know, there's going to have to be business infrastructure that supports that. Resources that need to be out there, and transportation options, and then housing and accommodations, and dining options, and all that kind of stuff. I've had fun writing about this, just predicting that kind of future. So I think the science is great, of course, but it's not going to be the sole driver. It's not why we went to the moon, for goodness sakes, right? I mean, we figured out how to do science from that, but it wasn't the driver. And so I totally agree with you that science may not be the driver. But I'm going to try to get as much science
That's
as I
why we're
possibly
here today.
can.
No, thank you. That's a nice framing question, because the whole point of today is to start with the history, which has been about exploration, and then to say, you know what, we can look beyond that now. I think we've just got time for, I'd like to set the precedent, I'd like to take a question from the app. So we've got a couple here. Robin, would you like to answer either of those? One is about, are there sort of environmental benefits to manufacturing in space? Would it be less polluting? Or are there specific examples of therapies or materials that have come from microgravity? So basically, it's a question about the commercial potential of microgravity manufacturing.
Right, so on the first question, we've had a number of spin-offs actually from NASA technology that are directly impacting benefits to life here on Earth. In fact, in my area of life support, our water processing technology has been used in a ground-based filtration system that's been used across the world for disaster relief and in rural areas where they don't have clean water. So that's one example.
And then the other one is, are there specific therapies or materials that have come from microgravity, or is it still very much kind of, in theory, we could do this?
There's some pharmaceuticals, drugs that have actually gone into the marketplace that started with space-based research. On osteoporosis is one example. There's a drug for muscular dystrophy. So yes, there are therapies that are making their way into the market.
Okay, brilliant. Well, that's all we've got time for, so thank you very much to our three panelists.